Pro wrestling has a long and storied history, dating back as far as the Civil War era that even President Abraham Lincoln dabbled in an earlier version of professional wrestling. With longevity like that, pro wrestling has had many landmark moments in its history, which is why for the next 52 weeks, we are going to highlight the biggest events in pro wrestling history. Pardon the wrestling, but I am Bryan, and it's time for This Week in Pro Wrestling History. During the mid-1980s, while the rise of Vince McMahon's WWF was beginning to take hold, territorial mainstays still existed at the time, one which was Verne Gagne's AWA in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Legend and future Hall of Famer Stan Hansen was the then AWA World Heavyweight Champion, and on June 29, 1986, he was scheduled to defend the championship against Nick Bockwinkel. However, Stan Hansen had no-showed the event, and as legend goes, it is believed that Stan Hansen was actually in the building that night, but he was told by Gagne that he was going to be dropping the title to Nick Bockwinkel. Being protective of his spot, Hansen allegedly walked out. At this time, Hansen was also working days for All Japan Pro Wrestling, and he called their president Giant Baba asking if he had any upcoming matches booked for title defenses. Hansen went on to defend the AWA Championship in Japan, despite what had transpired in AWA. And due to Hansen's no-show, Gagne had crowned Nick Bockwinkel the AWA Champion by forfeit. Hansen's refusal to do business led to legal action being threatened by the AWA, specifically because Hansen was still touring as AWA Champion. So in response, Hansen ran over the belt with his truck before mailing the title back to Verne Gagne. While the 1998 King of the Ring on June 28th is most remembered for the legendary Hell in a Cell match between Undertaker and Mankind, elsewhere on the card, Stone Cold Steve Austin was set to defend the WWF Championship against Kane in a First Blood match. Wrestling fans at the time would know how difficult it would be for Austin to make the fully masked and clothed Kane to bleed at all. And after some interference from Undertaker and Mankind, Taker accidentally hit Austin with a chair, causing Austin to bleed, thus granting Kane his first and only WWF Championship win. Seeing Kane with the Big Eagle title was a fever dream, and one that would last less than 24 hours. The following night on Raw, June 29th, we would see Kane make his only defense of the WWF Championship in a rematch against Austin, which saw Austin come out on top and pick up his second WWF Championship. This was the shortest reign since Bret Hart had a similar fate happen to him the prior year. Bret won the title at an In Your House event and lost the title right back to Psycho Sid due to interference from none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin. One of the biggest influences in professional wrestling history for many of the big stars of the 70s and 80s would be Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. Someone that was so influential to Ric Flair that Flair lifted a lot from Buddy's wrestling persona for his own, including the obvious one, his nickname, and of course, the Figure 4 leg lock. Modern wrestling fans may associate the nickname of Nature Boy and the Figure 4 leg lock with Ric Flair, but its history traces back to the first ever Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Heavyweight Champion. On June 30th, 1961, at the original Comiskey Park on the south side of Chicago, Buddy would go on to challenge Pat O'Connor in front of a reported 38,622 fans for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. At the time, this was a record for the largest attended pro wrestling show in history. Buddy would go on to defeat Pat in a 2 out of 3 falls match and win his first and only NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Alongside the aforementioned Flair, AJ Styles and Cody Rhodes can say they are an elite company, with Buddy Rogers being the only 4 men to hold the NWA World Heavyweight Championship and the WWE Championship. That's pretty good company right there. Continuing the Chicago connection, on June 30th, 2008, CM Punk made history of his own. CM Punk was quickly becoming a fast rising star in 2008. During the draft that year, he was moved from the doomed ECW brand over to Raw. While Punk was an integral part of the rebirth of ECW at the time, and even held a championship there, oftentimes that version of the ECW championship is not looked upon as a world title, nor does WWE's vision of ECW bring about any warm, fuzzy feelings. So while it was a huge loss to ECW to lose CM Punk, it was a big gain for fans of his because this means he was going to be taken more seriously amongst the roster. The Money in the Bank ladder match was still a newer concept at this time and still took place annually at WrestleMania before eventually getting its own pay-per-view event. Punk won the 2008 version of this ladder match, and spoiler, he would win the following year as well. However, it was June 30th, 2008 that Punk would win his first World Championship in WWE. And as I alluded to, I'm not going to count ECW here. Punk would cash in on Edge after Batista had put the boots to him in the previous segment. Punk even defended the title later that night against JBL, and he was successful. Not a bad start for the Second City Saint. Before CM Punk kept talking about being the real world's champion on AEW Collision a couple of years ago, Ric Flair was doing the same thing back in 1991. In 1991, WCW's championship at the time was also the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which is confusing, but I digress. WCW's main championship at the time was held by the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. He was holding one of the most iconic pieces of wrestling history, oftentimes simply known as the Big Gold Belt. Since the title was still technically the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, Flair was beholden to the deposit rule for the title belt, which was the current holder of the title was required to place a $25,000 deposit down for the belt itself. This was to ensure the NWA would get their belt back after the champion relinquished it. This would be placed into an account that accrued interest, and the champion would get the $25,000 plus interest once the reign was over. However, on July 1st, 1991, Flair was let go from WCW while still holding the championship due to ongoing issues between himself and WCW Executive Vice President at the time, Jim Herd. Flair refused to give the belt back because Herd and WCW refused to give his deposit back. This led to the iconic moment of Flair appearing on WWF television with the Big Gold Belt, which was seen then and even now as an unheard of prospect. It would be like if Jon Moxley showed back up on Raw with the AEW World Championship. Back to the Flair and CM Punk connection, Flair would go on WWF television calling himself the real world's champion. The following year, Ric Flair did return the original belt back to WCW, and WCW would even get the last laugh regarding belts, but we'll get there. July 2nd, 2001 would bring about the 423rd edition of Monday Night Raw, which was emanating from the Tacoma Dome in Tacoma, Washington. On paper, this Raw wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary, except for the main event. A main event that featured one of the most cited colossal failures in WWE history. This was a few months after Vince and the WWF had purchased WCW from Time Warner. And while many of the bigger talents of WCW were still under Time Warner contracts, like Hulk Hogan and Goldberg, some of the lower tiered stars were immediately available to the WWF. Among those were the final WCW World Champion Booker T and Buff Bagwell. WWF, not entirely sure what they were going to do with WCW at that point in time, did a backdoor pilot of sorts for WCW at the end of this particular episode of Monday Night Raw. The main event saw Booker T defending the WCW Championship against Buff Bagwell. The ring aprons, the graphics, the referee, and even the announcers would change over for the main event of the show. Scott Hudson and Arn Anderson were on the call, with Stacy Keibler doing the ring announcing and Nick Patrick officiating. However, this match was not received well by the crowd at all, and some theorists would say that WWF and Vince deliberately sabotaged their own idea. The match didn't even go 5 minutes before featuring a run-in from Steve Austin and Kurt Angle. This would be Buff Bagwell's first and only appearance on WWF television in his entire career. And of course, Booker T would be a little more fortunate, as he would go on to great success and even today is still commentating on NXT. WWE has had several faces of the company over the course of its history. Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, John Cena being the most prevalent. However, in 2025, it's safe to say that mantle belongs to the American Nightmare, Cody Rhodes. The former WWE champion made his debut for WWE, however, on July 2nd, 2007, in a backstage segment on Raw with his father, Dusty Rhodes. The segment began with Dusty introducing Hacksaw Jim Duggan to Cody Rhodes, even though in reality this was to introduce Cody to the audience at home. The segment's main purpose, however, was to set up Cody's first match on television, as after Hacksaw Jim Duggan left, Randy Orton appeared demanding Dusty to introduce his kid to him. While we were still some time away from Orton and Cody teaming up together in Legacy, they were introduced to each other by Orton slapping Dusty right in front of Cody. This would eventually lead to a match 2 weeks later, which Cody would lose to Randy Orton. But this was the first glimpse of two future Hall of Famers meeting each other, with the legendary Dusty Rhodes watching them both on. Though this event aired on an episode of WWF Superstars on July 30th, this event took place on July 3rd. And considering its place in history, we thought it was appropriate to include the date it was taped on. At this point in time, Bret Hart was the WWF champion, and his would-be opponent on this episode of WWF Superstars was Bob Backlund. Backlund was a couple years into his second stint with the WWF, and though he started his comeback in WWF winning quite frequently, the prior few months leading up to this match with Bret Hart had him toiling around in the lower card. That's why it was an unexpected move at the time for Backlund to challenge Bret to a championship match. Bret, however, accepted that challenge. The finish to the match saw Backlund believing he won on an inside cradle. He celebrated just a little too early, even helping Bret get back up to his feet. But when Bret was back up on his feet, he delivered an inside cradle of his own, except this time it was for the count of 3, and the champion retained. After Bret reached out his hand for a display of sportsmanship, Backlund slapped Bret and locked him in the crossface chicken wing, beginning Backlund's heel run that year and his eventual second WWF championship. We'll talk about how that run ended in November later this year. Let the War Games begin! The 4th of July is often a day full of fireworks, cookouts, and family here in the United States, but in 1987 at the NWA's Great American Bash, it was also the debut of the very first WarGames match. If you're unfamiliar with WarGames, or AEW's version known as Blood and Guts, two teams are pitted against each other inside a double ring and a double cage. A member from each team would start, and then at preset intervals, a member from one team would join, and at the beginning of the match, this would give a team a 2-on-1 advantage. Then at the next interval, the other team would get a chance to even it up. Until all participants are in the ring, the match cannot end. However, once everyone was in the cage, the match would officially begin in what is known as the Match Beyond. During the NWA's time holding WarGames matches, the match could only end via submission, knockout, or forfeit. Additionally, the cage would have a roof, much like we see with WWE's Hell in a Cell cage. When WCW started doing WarGames matches annually at Fall Brawl, they would incorporate pinfalls as a means to winning. After the closure of WCW, WWE wouldn't hold a WarGames match until 2017 when NXT held it at NXT TakeOver WarGames 2017, and did so to a criticized reception when it was revealed the WWE version would not have a roof on its cage. Not many things can last well over 40 years, but the concept developed by Dusty Rhodes in the NWA that premiered on July 4th, 1987 is one of wrestling's most beloved creations and is currently a fixture on an annual basis in both WWE and AEW. New Japan finally makes its way into this video as Dominion would take place on July 5th, 2015 from Osaka-jo Hall, New Japan's first show from there in over 20 years. The show featured the likes of WWE superstar Shinsuke Nakamura as well as AEW talent like the Young Bucks defending the tag team titles against Roppongi Vice and Red Dragon. Katsuyori Shibata was also in action, Kushida challenging Kenny Omega for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship. But of course, the main event featured Kazuchika Okada and AJ Styles, who was just a few months away from signing with WWE. AJ Styles was the IWGP Heavyweight Champion at the time of this event, and the work rate in some of the top matches on the show is certainly worth going out of your way to watch. It's also a great glimpse at Okada and AJ specifically, as this featured both men in their absolute prime with no strings attached. Something perhaps a little more well known and rounding out this week in pro wrestling history is the evolution of Matt Hardy. Matt Hardy had been back in TNA for a couple years at this point, but leading into the summer of 2016, he had turned heel and was revealed as one of the mystery attackers of his brother Jeff. The follow-up to this reveal was the debut of Broken Matt Hardy. While Jeff had no problems beating Matt a few times throughout June of 2016, it was the final Deletion where this feud would come to its apex. The final deletion taking place on the July 5th edition of Impact was a cinematic match taking place on the Hardy compound. This is one of those things you need to see it to believe it type deals, and if you click on the upper right hand corner, TNA has this in its entirety on their YouTube page, so I highly recommend seeing it for yourself. You really had to buy into the story taking place because it sure wasn't like anything you had ever seen before. There were several follow-ups to the final deletion featuring Matt and the Broken Universe, but this is where it all began, and it happened on July 5th of 2016. This week in pro wrestling history featured quite a few landmark moments. But what was your favorite? Leave it down in the comment section below. And if you want to see an expansion of one of these events, let us know in the comments as well. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, as that is the easiest way for more wrestling fans like you to find this video. And of course, consider subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. Pardon the wrestling, but I am Bryan. Thank you for watching.